Okay, so picture this. It is August 24th, 1926. We're in New York City, and the entire city has, well, it's effectively just stopped.
Stopped is one word for it. I'd say it's erupted. It's just chaos.
Right, we're talking about a funeral. But this is not a somber, quiet affair. This is mass hysteria. You have,
Yeah.
what, an estimated 100,000 people?
At least 100,000 people flooding the streets. That's like the population of a small city just crammed into a few blocks of Manhattan.
And the atmosphere. It wasn't just grief, was it?
Yeah.
It was actually dangerous.
Oh, incredibly dangerous. The police had to bring in over 100 mounted officers. We're talking horses, literally pushing back into the crowd just to keep people from being crushed.
Brushed against the windows of the funeral home, which were being smashed by fans trying to get in.
Trying to get one last look. And the stories from the time are, well, they feel like fiction. Reports of riots.
I saw reports of despondent fans committing suicide.
Yes, the sheer grief was on another level. And inside the funeral home, it was a circus.
The story about the honor guard always gets me. The funeral home, Frankie Campbell's.
That's the one. They allegedly hired actors to pose as a fascist black shirt honor guard,
Claiming they were sent by Mussolini himself.
which was a total fabrication. Mussolini didn't send anyone. It was pure publicity.
And you think about it.
Yeah.
It sounds like the reaction to, I don't know, the Beatles in the 60s. Or maybe Michael Jackson's passing.
Exactly. But this was the silent film era. There was no internet, no 24-hour news cycle to amplify it. This was all just raw, organic hysteria for one man.
Rudolph Valentino.
The Latin lover, the chic, the man who you could argue was the first true male sex symbol of the silver screen.
And that's really what we're going to unpack today. Because his story isn't just a biography of an actor, it's so much more.
It really is. It's about the invention of modern celebrity. And I think more importantly, it's about this huge cultural battle over masculinity that was raging in the 1920s.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to figure out how this Italian gardener, who, spoiler alert, was briefly homeless,
Slept on benches in Central Park.
how that guy became the world's most desired man, and at the very same time, why he was so hated by so many American men.
And the tragic insecurity that I think defined him right up until his last breath.
So let's get into it. Let's go back to the beginning. Before he was Valentino, the icon.
He was just Rodolfo. Rodolfo Pietro Filiberto Raffaello Guglielmi.
Wow. Okay, try saying that 5 times fast.
I practiced. He was born in 1895 in Castellaneta, Italy. And what's interesting right away is that he wasn't, born a star.
Oh, wow.
In fact, he was seen as a bit of a failure in his youth.
Yeah, that surprised me. Like, his attempts to join the military, you think of Valentino as this virile, strong figure, but he failed the physicals, right?
He did. And the reasons were pretty specific. They said his chest was too small.
Too small. The man who became famous for taking his shirt off.
The very same. That and a minor eye defect. So he was rejected from the army. And you have to put that in context. In 1913 Italy, masculinity is all tied up with military service. So being told you're not physically fit enough, that's a huge blow.
So he's a bit of a washout at home. He can't find his place.
Exactly. He gets an agricultural degree, but can't really make it work. So, like so many others, he looks to America.
But this is the detail that I think tells you everything. When we think of immigrants arriving in 1913, we think of Ellis Island, steerage.
The whole huddled masses experience.
Not Valentino. He travels first class.
He does. His mother bought him a second-class ticket, but he found it unsuitable. So he upgraded himself. He wanted to arrive in style.
It's such a fake-it-till-you-make-it mentality from the very start.
It is. And it meant he got to bypass the big inspection at Ellis Island, but he still had to talk to immigration. And he stretched the truth a bit.
Just a bit.
He told them he was an agriculturalist, which was true. But then he gives his middle name as De Marchesi.
Of the Marquises.
Exactly, trying to sound like he was nobility. He understood even then that Americans have a thing for European aristocracy.
The hustle began the second he stepped off the boat.
It really did. He had a decent amount of money, about $4,000, but he just blew through it.
Living the high life.
Totally. Staying in a boarding house, but dining at the best restaurants, buying champagne for everyone, projecting this image.
But obviously the money runs out.
And when it ran out, the crash was brutal. I mean, we are talking about a guy who went from first-class travel to, as you said, sleeping on benches in Central Park.
There's a steep fall.
It was vertical. He got a job as a landscape gardener on Long Island and got fired for crashing the owner's motorcycle.
Of course he did.
He polished brass, he swept floors. There are these accounts of him washing himself with water from fire hydrants because he couldn't afford a 12-cent room for the night.
It's just incredible to think that only a few years later, this same person would be the most famous man on the planet. So how does he get out of the park?
He dances his way out.
Taxi dancing.
Yeah.
Now, can we just explain what that was? Because it's not about driving a cab.
No. Essentially, you were a dance partner for hire. Wealthy women would go to restaurants or clubs, and they'd pay a handsome young man like Valentino to dance with them.
And this is where that term lounge lizard comes from.
Exactly. It wasn't a compliment. It implied you were a man who lived off of women who didn't have a real job. But for Valentino, it was his ticket into high society.
But it also got him into a lot of trouble. Which brings us to the de Saulles scandal. This could have ended his story before it even began.
Oh, it's a messy, messy affair. He gets friendly with this Chilean heiress, Blanca de Saulles, who's in a very ugly divorce with her powerful husband.
Valentino gets involved.
He testifies on her behalf, provides evidence that her husband was unfaithful. Now just think about the optics here. You have this immigrant lounge lizard testifying against a rich, powerful American businessman.
Retaliation was probably swift.
Immediate. The vice squad raids his apartment and they arrest him. They charge him with being a pimp.
Whoa. That is a serious charge.
It was almost certainly fabricated to discredit him. The DA mocks him in the press, calling him a bogus count and pointing out that he wore corsets and wristwatches.
And there it is. The first attack on his masculinity. The wristwatch.
Which is funny because now it's standard, but back then, real men had pocket watches. Wristwatches were seen as effeminate.
So the charges get dropped, but his name is Mud in New York.
Completely. And then the story gets even crazier. Blanca de Saulles actually shoots and kills her ex-husband a year later.
Oh, my God.
So Valentino is terrified. He's going to be dragged into this huge murder trial. So he does what so many people do when they need a fresh start.
He goes west to Hollywood.
To Hollywood.
Okay, so he arrives in Hollywood around 1917. Is he an instant star?
Not even close. And this is really key to understanding the shift he caused. In 1917, Hollywood had a very specific idea of what a hero looked like.
All American, fair-skinned, blue-eyed.
Exactly. Guys like Wallace Reed, athletic, wholesome, smiling. Valentino was dark, graceful, exotic. He didn't look like a hero to them.
So they cast him as the villain.
The heavy, the gangster, the seducer. The legendary director D.W. Griffith actually told him he was too foreign and needed to act less expressively. Basically said, you don't fit.
But someone saw something. A screenwriter named June Mathis.
June Mathis is the hero of this story, one of the most powerful women in Hollywood at the time. She saw him in a small role and just knew. She was casting this huge epic, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
And she wanted him for the lead.
Against everyone's advice, she fought for him. And that film, in 1921, changed absolutely everything.
There's one scene, right? The tango.
The tango. You have to remember, the tango was seen as this dirty, dangerous dance from Argentina. And Valentino performs it with this incredible controlled intensity.
He's seductive, not aggressive.
Exactly. He's leading, but his focus is entirely on his partner. And suddenly, that exotic look wasn't villainous anymore.
It was desirable.
It shifted the entire paradigm. Women didn't want the boy next door anymore. They wanted the dark, mysterious stranger who could dance.
And then came the sheik.
The sheik, later that same year. This is what cemented the legend.
Yeah.
He plays an Arab sheik who, well, he kidnaps an English woman.
The plot is, let's say, very problematic by today's standards.
Oh, deeply problematic. It's basically a romanticized abduction fantasy. But in 1921, women went wild for it. He became the great lover. And this is the key thing. He was arguably the first male star created entirely by the female gaze.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, other male stars were men that women also liked. Douglas Fairbanks was the guy you wanted to be and the guy your wife wanted to date. Valentino was different. He was made for women. He appealed directly to them, and that made him a massive threat to the average American man.
I can see that. Your wife is swooning over this guy in eyeliner and robes who dances the tango.
Right, and you're just some guy in a suit who comes home tired from work. He represented a type of romantic ideal that American men felt they couldn't and didn't want to compete with.
And that leads right into the backlash. Because for every woman who loved him, there was a man who seemed to despise him.
It was a visceral hatred. They called him a dandy, a Vassalino. They made fun of his pomaded hair, his jewelry, everything.
This wasn't just idle chatter either. This was in newspapers.
It was mainstream, and it all came to a head with one particular incident that really, truly broke him. The pink powder puff incident.
Okay, let's unpack this. This was an editorial in the Chicago Tribune in July of 1926, just a month before he died.
Yes. An anonymous writer claimed he saw a vending machine for pink talcum powder in a men's restroom.
Pink powder. For men.
And instead of just thinking it was weird, he decided to blame the entire feminization of American men on one person, Rudolph Valentino.
I have the quote right here, and it's just shocking. It asks, why didn't someone quietly drown Rudolph Guglielmo years ago?
Quietly drown him. It's horrific. The writer calls him a painted pansy and says he's ruining America's sons. It's a direct assault on his very being.
How did Valentino take that? I mean, surely he had thick skin by then.
He didn't. That's the tragic part. He was incredibly sensitive. He carried that newspaper clipping around with him, showed it to people. He was absolutely furious.
And he challenged the writer to a fight, right?
He did. He wrote an open letter challenging the anonymous writer to a boxing match since dueling was illegal. He was desperate to prove he wasn't a powder puff.
The writer never came forward, of course.
Of course not. But to prove his point, Valentino staged a boxing match against a sports writer on the roof of the Ambassador Hotel in New York.
On the roof. It's so dramatic.
And Valentino won. He was actually quite athletic. But the victory felt empty. He told the journalist H.L. Mencken that the whole thing was revolting. He felt trapped by his own image.
And his chaotic personal life really didn't help matters. For being the great lover, his own love life was a total disaster.
A complete disaster. Let's start with wife number one, Jean Acker.
The marriage that lasted, what, 6 hours?
Something like that. They got married, and on their wedding night, she locked him out of the hotel room.
Locked him out.
Yep. The marriage was over before it began. A ridiculous tragedy, as he called it.
But then came Natasha Rambova. She was different.
A very different kind of person. She was an art director, very intellectual, very controlling, and the relationship started with him getting arrested.
For bigamy.
Right. He married her in Mexico before his divorce from Acker was legally final in California. He was jailed, humiliated.
And once they were finally together, she tried to change his image.
She hated the chic. She pushed him into these artistic films like Monsieur Beaucaire, where he's wearing powdered wigs and beauty marks.
Which just fed right into the effeminate narrative.
Absolutely. The male audience hated it. She became so influential and so difficult that the studios eventually banned her from his movie sets. It was in his contract.
Wow. But he wasn't just a puppet, was he? He fought back against the studios himself.
He did. People forget this, but he went on a one-man strike. He refused to make what he called factory films. He wanted quality.
So the biggest star in the world just stops making movies.
He stops filming. But to make money, he goes on a national dance tour sponsored by a beauty clay company.
Mineralavo.
The Mineralava Tour. Can you imagine a top star today doing that, judging beauty contests for a face mask company?
It sounds bizarre.
But it worked. It proved that he was the draw, not the studio. He got a better contract. So by 1926, he's back on top with the son of the sheik. And then it all ends.
August 15th, 1926. He collapses at his hotel in New York.
A perforated ulcer and appendicitis. It led to peritonitis, a massive infection. In the pre-antibiotic era, that was a death sentence.
He has surgery. And this is the detail that just gets me. When he wakes up from the anesthesia, what's the first thing he asks?
He looks at the doctor and asks, "Doctor, am I a pink puff?"
Oh, that's just heartbreaking. He was still thinking about that editorial.
Even on his deathbed, his masculinity was his deepest wound. The doctor, to his credit, told him he'd been very brave, but the infection was just too severe.
He died on August 23rd at only 31 years old.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The funeral, the chaos.
And the circus inside the funeral home. Pola Negri, his supposed fiancée.
Oh, Pola. She put on a performance, fainting over the coffin multiple times, sending a massive floral arrangement that spelled out her own name.
It all felt very Hollywood.
It was. And then the sad, simple fact that Valentino himself had nowhere to be buried. He was broke.
So where did he end up?
June Mathis, the screenwriter who discovered him, stepped in. She had an empty crypt she'd bought for her husband, who she'd since divorced. She let them place Valentino there temporarily.
Temporarily.
But then Mathis herself died the next year and was buried in the crypt next to him. And they're still there, side by side. The woman who made his career is sheltering him in death.
And his grave became a shrine. The woman in black.
The woman in black. The legend of a mysterious veiled woman who brought a red rose to his grave every year.
Was that real?
Well, it started as a PR stunt, but like so many things with Valentino, the myth became real. Other women took up the tradition, and it continues to this day.
So after all of this,
Mhm.
why do we still talk about him? What's the final takeaway?
I think it's that he completely changed what a leading man could be. He proved that softness, that romance, that vulnerability could be a strength on screen. He paved the way for every heartthrob that came after him.
He made it okay to be the romantic lead, not just the action hero.
Exactly. But he paid an incredible price for it. He was a man who wanted to be a farmer, but he was trapped in the image of the great lover.
Charlie Chaplin had a great quote about him. He said, "No man had greater attraction for women than Valentino. No man was more deceived by them."
That's perfect. And the final irony is the pink powder puff incident. The very thing that made him a star, his unique, expressive masculinity, was the very thing he was attacked for. He died trying to prove he was a man, never realizing that just by being himself, he'd already redefined the term.
A powerful thought to end on. He was a pioneer, whether he knew it or not.
A true original.
Well, that's our deep dive on the life and legend of Rudolph Valentino. Thanks for listening.
We'll catch you on the next one.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We have an absolutely massive stack of documents today, and I mean that literally and figuratively.
It's a big one.
It is. We are looking at a topic that is, on the surface, about civil engineering. But when you really peel back the layers, it's about survival. It's about the sheer audacity of humans looking at the ocean and saying, no, you stop here.
It really is a story about the ultimate boundary. We are talking about the Delta Works in the Netherlands.
The Delta working.
Right. And to just call it a project feels like it's a disservice. This is more like a planetary modification.
Well, I was reading through the intro material, and the accolade that really jumped out at me wasn't from a Dutch organization.
Oh.
It was from the American Society of Civil Engineers. They declared this one of the 7 wonders of the modern world.
That is no small praise. I mean, that puts it in the league of the Panama Canal, the Golden Gate Bridge.
The Empire State Building. Exactly. But here's the thing that struck me while reading. When you think of the Golden Gate Bridge, you think about connection, right? Getting from A to B.
Yep.
The Panama Canal, you think about commerce, cutting travel time. But the Delta Works, this feels existential.
That is the perfect word for it. It's totally existential. The Netherlands is a geological oddity. It's the river delta for 3 massive European rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt. And a huge percentage of the land is below sea level.
A huge percentage.
Without these works, the country as we know it simply wouldn't exist. It would be a swamp or, just the bottom of the North Sea.
So the mission statement in the source material, it's phrased in this very dry, bureaucratic way. But when you visualize it, it's wild. The goal was shortening the coastline.
It sounds so abstract, doesn't it?
It sounds like a supervillain plot. I shall shorten the coastline. But in this context, it's the primary defense strategy. Can you maybe walk us through the geometry of that? Why does shortening the line save the country?
It's all about efficiency and exposure. So imagine the southwest of the Netherlands before these works began. It wasn't a solid block of land like we might see on a simplified map today.
Not at all.
It was a jagged, fractured collection of islands, deep estuaries, winding inlets. The sea didn't just touch the edge, it reached deep inland, wrapping around all these little islands.
It's like the frayed edge of a piece of denim.
That's a perfect analogy, and every single inch of that frayed edge had to be defended. We are talking about hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of old earthen dikes.
That all needed constant monitoring, maintenance.
Constant repair. If you have 700 kilometers of coastline, you have 700 kilometers of potential failure points.
So the logic is just less coast, less danger.
Precisely. The shortening concept is brutal efficiency. If you look at the map, you see these wide mouths where the estuaries open to the sea.
Right.
If you block those mouths, if you connect the islands at their outer edge, you effectively draw a straight line across the coast. Yeah. You seal the bathtub.
And by doing that, you cut the coastline that needs defending by
roughly 700 kilometers.
Well, you trade hundreds of kilometers of winding, vulnerable, old-fashioned dikes for just a few kilometers of massive, high-tech fortified dams.
That is the trade-off. You put all your eggs in a few very, very strong baskets.
But this wasn't just a case of engineers getting bored and looking for a cool project. The sources make it crystal clear that there was a catalyst, a specific dark moment in history that forced all this to happen.
The North Sea flood of 1953.
The details in the reading were just harrowing. I think when people hear flood in a modern context, they think of a wet basement or maybe a river overbanking and ruining some carpet. This was
a whole different ballgame, a catastrophe on a national scale. It was the perfect storm. Quite literally, you had a high spring tide combined with a severe windstorm over the North Sea.
just pushing all that water right into the funnel of the English Channel.
Exactly, and straight at the Dutch coast. The water rose rapidly in the middle of the night.
And the dikes weren't ready.
The dikes were in terrible condition. You have to remember the context. This is 1953.
Yep.
The country was still recovering from World War II. During the war, maintenance had been, well, it was completely neglected, and you had the economic depression in the 30s before that.
So the authorities knew, right? The reports were there.
Oh, they knew. There were reports sitting on desks saying the dikes were insufficient, but indecision and the war just paralyzed them.
That's the part that's so frustrating. The knowledge was there, the engineering reports were there, but they couldn't get the political will to act until after the disaster happened.
It's a tragic recurring theme in infrastructure, isn't it?
It is.
Proactive prevention is politically difficult to sell. It costs money and nobody sees the benefit because, well, nothing happens. That is the benefit. Reactive reconstruction is politically mandatory.
So the flood hits. Over 1,800 people lose their lives. Thousands of homes destroyed, livestock just wiped out,
Yeah.
and the mindset shifts overnight.
It shifted from, we should probably fix this eventually, to never again. That became the national mantra. The Delta Works Commission was formed almost immediately.
And their job wasn't just to patch the holes.
No, it was to rethink the entire relationship between the land and the sea.
And this brings us to the first major section of our deep dive, the mathematics of safety. Because I expected this to be a story about concrete and steel, but the Delta Commission started with philosophy and statistics.
They did. They realized that the old way of thinking, just looking at history, was a trap. Before this, they would look at the highest flood level ever recorded, maybe add a few centimeters for a safety margin, and build the wall to that height.
Which works right up until a storm comes along that's bigger than any you remember.
Exactly. History is not a predictor of the future, especially with weather. The Commission needed a conceptual framework that looked forward.
So they turned to probability.
They turned to probability. And they introduced this concept of the delta norm.
I spent some time looking at the maps and the notes about these dike rings. It's such a fascinating way to organize a country. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, so think of the Netherlands not as one single landmass, but as a series of separate watertight compartments. In the documents, these are called dike ring areas.
And each compartment is an area surrounded by a continuous line of primary sea defenses.
It almost reminds me of the bulkheads on a ship. You know, if one compartment breaches, the water is contained there and the rest of the ship stays afloat.
That is a very, very accurate analogy. But unlike a ship, these compartments are where millions of people live and work and sleep.
Right.
So the Commission identified the major areas that needed protection. And then, and this is the part of governance that is incredibly difficult, they had to decide how much protection each ring deserved.
Deserved is such a heavy word when you're talking about human safety.
It is, but it's the cold logic of econometrics. You cannot build walls to the moon. It's physically impossible and economically ruinous.
So you have to define acceptable risk.
You have to. And to do that, they performed a cost-benefit analysis. On one side of the equation is the cost of building and maintaining the dams. On the other side is the cost of a flood. And calculating the cost of a flood, I mean, it seems straightforward for things like buildings or cows. You could look up the market price. But the sources mentioned they included the loss of human life in the equation.
They did. And this is where it gets uncomfortable.
Yeah, I paused when I read that section. It feels taboo, almost immoral, to put a price tag on a human being. But the model needed a number to function. The source we have mentions data from 2008 where a human life was valued at 2.2 million.
It sounds callous, I know. You were worth 2.2 million euros. But in public policy, if you don't have that number, you can't justify the investment.
Also,
If the loss of life is considered incalculable or infinite, then the budget to prevent it becomes undefined and nothing gets built. By quantifying the value of a life, however grim that feels, you can mathematically prove to the government that spending $5 billion on a dam is a bargain compared to the statistical cost of the lives it saves.
So they ran these numbers, they cranked the handle on the calculator, and they came up with the delta norm. And I was surprised to see that the safety standards aren't uniform across the country.
No.
Not every Dutch citizen gets the same level of protection.
No, they don't. And that is based on population density and economic impact. The highest standard is applied to the Randstad, the economic heart of the country in South Holland. That includes cities like Rotterdam, The Hague, Delft.
And the source says the acceptable risk there is 1 in 10,000 years.
Let's really look at that number. 1 in 10,000.
It's huge.
It is. Now, that doesn't mean a flood happens once every 10,000 years like a comet coming back. It means that in any given year, this year, next year, the year after, there is a 0.01% chance of the defenses failing.
That is an incredibly high standard. I was trying to find a comparison. I think the standard for dike safety in places like New Orleans before Katrina was, what, 1 in 100? Significantly lower.
Much, much lower. The Dutch standard is arguably the most rigorous in the world, and there's a specific reason for that mentioned in the technical notes. It isn't just because there are a lot of people there.
It's about warning time.
It's about warning time? Exactly. If you're dealing with a river flood, say the Mississippi or the Rhine further upstream, you can see the water rising days in advance.
You can pack your car, you can evacuate.
You have time. But a storm surge from the North Sea can develop in a matter of hours.
You cannot evacuate 4 million people from the Randstad overnight.
It is impossible. There is nowhere to go, and the roads would gridlock instantly. If the dikes fail in South Holland, the result is mass casualties. It would be the end of the nation as a functioning state. So the walls must be practically invincible.
But then you look at other areas, and the risk is set at 1 in 4,000 years. Still very safe, but, not quite as safe.
Right. And for river flooding, it's even lower, 1 in 12,250 years.
And that river flooding distinction is interesting. The source material points out a crucial difference: salinity.
Yes. River water is fresh water.
Why does the salt content matter for the safety standard? I mean, water is water when it's in your living room.
True, but for the recovery of the nation, it matters immensely. If you flood a farm with fresh water, it dries out, and maybe you lose a season of crops, but next year you can plant again.
Okay.
If you flood that same farm with North Sea salt water, you have salted the earth. The soil chemistry is destroyed. Nothing grows there for years, perhaps decades.
So the economic damage is exponentially higher.
Exactly. And so the protection against it must be higher.
So the delta works aren't just a physical barrier. They're a manifestation of a statistical model, a calculated gamble where the odds are heavily stacked in our favor, but it's still a gamble.
Engineering is always a gamble against nature. The Dutch just calculated the odds better than anyone else.
And decided 0.01% was the only number they could sleep with at night.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so they have the math, they have the delta norm, they have the budget. Now they have to actually build the things. And this is where the story shifts from a spreadsheet to a construction site. And the engineering evolution here is wild.
It really is. Because the original plan did not survive contact with reality.
The first idea in the 1950s seemed pretty blunt. It was the closed coast policy, just close the holes.
Right. The engineers looked at the map and said, we have these big estuaries, the Oosterschelde, the Grevelingen, and so on. Let's just build solid dams across the mouths.
From a purely hydraulic perspective, that makes sense. A solid dam is the strongest dam. No moving parts, just a mountain of sand and concrete.
It is. And for several of the smaller inlets, that's exactly what they did. They created freshwater lakes behind the dams. But when they got to the Oosterschelde, the Eastern Schelde, the plan hit a wall.
And the wall wasn't water.
The wall was people.
The source details a major conflict here. By the late 60s and early 70s, the world was changing. The environmental movement was starting to wake up.
And the Oosterschelde wasn't just a threat, it was a treasure. It was this unique tidal ecosystem teeming with life. Shellfish, lobsters, seals, unique birds.
And it was a home of the Dutch oyster and mussel industry.
Critically, yes.
I can imagine the fishermen weren't exactly thrilled about the idea of turning their tidal farm into a stagnant freshwater lake.
They were furious. And they were joined by environmentalists and scientists who argued that you can't just destroy a unique marine environment in the name of safety. There had to be another way.
This feels like a pivotal moment. Usually in these massive state projects, the steamroller just keeps moving. Sorry about your oysters, but we're building a dam.
Mm-hmm.
But here, the government actually blinked.
They didn't just blink, they pivoted. Parliament intervened. They amended the plan and demanded a solution that provided the safety of the delta norm but preserved the tidal environment.
Which sounds impossible. Keep the water out, but also let the water in.
It was a total engineering paradox. Build me a wall that isn't a wall. And the solution they came up with is the Oosterscheldekering, the storm surge barrier.
The description of this thing is just mind-boggling. The sources call it a semi-permeable dam.
So imagine a series of colossal concrete pillars, some the size of cathedrals, dropped into the mouth of the estuary. The scale is just hard to convey. These pillars are 30, 40 meters high.
Wow.
And between these pillars, they hung massive steel sliding gates.
So they're like valves,
Yeah.
giant valves.
Exactly. Under normal conditions, which is 99% of the time, the gates are lifted up high above the water.
So the tide flows in and out.
The tide flows in, the tide flows out, the oysters are happy, the water remains salty, the seals can swim through, the ecosystem is preserved.
But when the weather turns,
When a storm approaches and the water level is predicted to rise 3 meters above the mean, the buttons are pushed.
and the gates drop.
Massive hydraulic cylinders push these steel walls down, and in roughly an hour, the open estuary becomes a solid dam. The North Sea is locked out.
That is incredibly cool. It's active defense. It's not a passive wall. It's a machine.
A very, very expensive machine. The source notes that this change in plan from a solid dam to a storm surge barrier doubled or tripled the cost of that section and extended the timeline by years.
But it proved that safety and ecology could technically coexist if you have enough money and ingenuity.
If you have enough money, yes. Because remember, by not closing the estuary permanently, they created another problem. Since the tide still comes in every day, the dikes behind the barrier further inland were still exposed to the daily tidal water. So they had to strengthen hundreds of kilometers of those inner dikes anyway.
That was not a shortcut.
Not at all. It was the scenic, expensive, technically difficult route, but it saved the ecosystem.
There's another example of this engineering colliding with reality in the notes, the Rotterdam Challenge. This one seems even more complex because you're dealing with a major city.
The Maislandkering. This is perhaps even more visually striking than the Oosterschelde barrier.
The problem here was the Nieuwe Waterweg, the shipping channel.
Yes. Rotterdam is one of the biggest ports in the world. It is the gateway to Europe. You cannot dam the entrance to the port. You'd kill the economy immediately. Ships need to come and go 2004/7.
But you still have to protect the millions of people living behind it.
Correct. So the traditional solution would be to heighten the dikes along the river running through the city. Just make the walls taller.
But the source says that would have required demolishing historic parts of Rotterdam and other towns.
Imagine telling a city like Rotterdam, which was already flattened in World War II, that you need to bulldoze their historic center again to build a higher wall. It was socially unacceptable. The public pressure was immense.
So once again, they had to invent a new solution. They couldn't build up because of the buildings, and they couldn't build across because of the ships.
So they built arms.
The Maislandkering, looking at the diagram here, it looks like two curved floating gates resting in docks on either side of the river.
Think of two massive Eiffel Towers laid on their sides, curved to fit the river. They're just resting in dry docks on the banks. The river stays wide open for ships.
Okay.
But when the storm comes, they flood the docks, the gates float, and they swing out into the river like a pair of embracing arms.
And they meet in the middle?
They meet in the middle, they lock together, and then, this is the genius part, they flood the hollow chambers inside the gates themselves with water.
Ah, so they become heavy.
They become incredibly heavy and sink to the bottom, anchoring themselves into the riverbed.
A sunken steel wall.
It is the largest moving object on Earth, by some definitions. Specifically, the ball and socket joints that allow the gates to pivot. They're the largest ball joints in the world. Each one is 10 meters in diameter.
A ball joint the size of a house.
A ball joint made of high-grade steel that has to be smooth enough to rotate, but strong enough to hold back the entire North Sea pushing against the arm. The engineering precision is just staggering.
And it was completed in 1997. The sources say that this marked the end of the Delta Works.
Technically, yes. The Maislandkering was the final piece of the original puzzle. The Queen presided over the opening. It was mission accomplished.
But mission accomplished is always a dangerous phrase, isn't it?
Always.
Because as we look at the later documents, it becomes clear that finished is a very relative term.
Absolutely. Finished just means the concrete is dry. It doesn't mean the problem is gone. And before we talk about the future, we have to look at the hangover of the past. We talked about how the Oosterschelde was saved, but the sources are very honest that not everything went that smoothly.
Right. The projects designed in the 1950s and 60s, the solid dams we mentioned earlier, The source explicitly states that ecological effects were barely taken into consideration back then.
It was a different era. Nature was something to be conquered, not consulted. When you block those other estuaries, you stop the tide, you take a dynamic, flowing marine environment and turn it into a stagnant freshwater bucket.
The text mentions the transition is abrupt.
It's catastrophic for the existing life. The salt-loving plants die immediately. The fish that need to migrate are blocked. The birds that feed on the tidal flats lose their food source because the flats no longer dry out.
And there was a water quality issue too, wasn't there?
A big one. Rivers carry sediment and, unfortunately, pollution. In an open system, the tide flushes that out to sea. In a closed system, it settles at the bottom.
So you get this buildup of polluted sludge.
You get sludge, the water can become toxic with algae blooms, it can turn into a dead zone.
So they solved the quantity problem, keeping the ocean out,
Yeah.
but created a quality problem.
Exactly. And facing that reality led to a major paradigm shift. If you look at the documents from post-2008, the philosophy is completely different.
They call it building with nature.
It sounds like a marketing slogan, I know, but it's a profound change in engineering strategy.
How does it differ from the old concrete wall approach?
The old approach is static defense. Build a line, hold the line. Concrete, steel, asphalt. Building with nature is dynamic defense. It recognizes that nature is a force you can actually leverage.
The example that really stood out to me was room for the river.
This is a fascinating program. For centuries, the Dutch strategy for rivers was to squeeze them between higher and higher dikes to maximize farmland. The river became a narrow, fast-moving chute.
Which means if it overflows, the water's moving fast and high, like putting your thumb over a hose.
Right. Room for the river reverses that. They're actually moving dikes back, widening the riverbeds, lowering the floodplains.
They're giving land back to the water. That seems so counterintuitive for a country that is famous for creating land.
It's a radical shift. They are taking agricultural land and turning it into spillways or nature parks. The idea is, when the river floods, let it flood the park. It slows the water down, lowers the water level, and doesn't destroy anyone's home.
It's almost like a pressure relief valve, but made of land.
Precisely. It creates a buffer zone. It allows the water to be there without being a disaster. It's conceding space to gain safety.
There was another example called sand nourishment or the sand motor.
This is just brilliant in its simplicity. The coast is always eroding. The sea eats the sand. The old way to fix it was to put down concrete blocks or plant heavy grass to lock the dunes in place.
Or make the dunes rigid.
But rigid things break, and they stop the natural cycle of sand replenishment. So now with the sand motor, they dredge up millions of cubic meters of sand from the deep sea and dump it in a massive peninsula off the
A
coast.
strategic sand pile.
And then they do nothing. They just walk away. They let the wind and the currents distribute that sand along the coast over the next 20 years.
So the forces of nature do the construction work for you.
Exactly. It keeps the dunes healthy and growing, which makes them a better, more resilient barrier than any concrete wall could be.
It feels like a real maturity in engineering. Like, okay, we built the giant robot, but maybe we should also learn to dance.
That's a poetic way to put it. It's recognizing that the ecosystem is a layer of defense, not just an obstacle to be paved over.
I do want to pivot to the financials because wonder of the modern world doesn't come cheap. And the numbers here are staggering, even before you adjust for inflation.
It's a classic case of project creep, both in scope and in cost. In 1958, the original estimate was 3.3 billion guilders.
Which, for a small country just recovering from a war, is an enormous amount of money.
It was 20% of the national GDP at the time. Imagine the United States today deciding to build a project that cost $4 or $5 trillion. That's the level of national commitment we're talking about.
And that was just the estimate.
By the time it was finished in 1997, the cost was 8.2 billion guilders. A 2012 estimate put the total investment at around 13 billion US dollars.
Where did all that money come from? I saw a mention of the Marshall Plan.
The post-war U.S. aid was significant. About 400 million guilders helped to kickstart the recovery that made this possible. But there's a twist in the funding story that I find fascinating.
Oh.
A crucial funding source came from the ground itself.
The Groningen gas field.
Exactly. In the late 50s and early 60s, the Netherlands discovered a massive natural gas bubble in the north. The revenue from that gas, that aardgasbatten, was an incredible windfall for the state.
There's a bit of irony there, isn't there?
A massive irony.
Using fossil fuels to pay for the defense against rising seas, which are caused by...
Fossil fuels. It's a complex feedback loop, certainly. We're using the proceeds of carbon extraction to defend against the consequences of carbon emissions. But without that gas revenue, it's hard to say if the project could have been executed at this scale and quality. The gas paid for the dams.
So we have the barriers, we have the new philosophy, we have the bill paid, but the source material ends on a note that is anything but happily ever after.
No, the story doesn't end. It just enters a more frightening chapter. The source material discusses the Delta Commission of 2008, the second commission.
Right, this was the report looking not at the next 10 years, but at the next 2 centuries.
And the numbers in that report are alarming. They highlighted that the original Delta works were built for the climate of the 20th century. But the climate of the 21st and 22nd centuries is a different beast.
We're talking about sea level rise.
The report advises the government to plan for a rise in the North Sea of 1.3 meters by the year 2100. And looking further out, to the year 2200, they modeled a rise of 4 meters.
4 meters, that's over 12 feet.
12 feet of vertical rise. That essentially negates the current dikes. If the sea rises 4 meters, the current Maeslankering, the Oosterschelde barrier, they'd be overwhelmed. They'd just be speed bumps.
The report mentions a proposed spending of over $100 billion through the year 2100 just to keep up.
It's an unending mortgage. You have to keep paying just to stay in the house.
But there was one detail in that report that really gave me chills. It mentioned that they're even drawing up worst-case scenarios for evacuation.
That stopped me in my tracks, too.
We are talking about one of the most advanced nations on Earth, with the best water engineers in history, having a serious meeting about what if we lose?
It highlights the limits of engineering. The Delta works are a triumph of human ingenuity, but they are not magic. They're physical barriers in a changing world. And even the Dutch are realizing that there might be a limit to how high you can build the wall.
What if we have to leave? That is such an existential thought for a nation.
It really reframes the whole story. We started by talking about this static wonder of the world, this finished monument, but it's actually a living, breathing struggle, a war that doesn't end.
It makes that Delta norm, that 1 in 10,000 number, feel less like a guarantee and more like a temporary truce.
The Delta norm taught us that safety isn't a binary state, safe or unsafe. It's a statistic. And as the sea level rises, the denominator in that fraction gets smaller. Your 1 in 10,000 risk becomes 1 in 1,000, then 1 in 100. Unless you keep building higher.
It really makes you wonder. The Netherlands is basically the laboratory for the rest of the world.
In many ways, yes. As sea levels rise globally, coastal cities everywhere, New York, Jakarta, Shanghai, Miami, are looking at the Dutch model. They're hiring Dutch engineers.
What that leads to the big question, the one that the source material leaves hanging in the air. We see the billions spent, the decades of work, the constant need for upgrades. Is this sustainable?
That is the question. Is the Dutch model of fortress engineering really the blueprint for the future, or is it a warning?
A warning that you can buy safety, but the price just keeps going up.
And that eventually, the physics might just outweigh the economics. Eventually, the water always wins.
It's a sobering thought to end on, but a really important one. The Delta works are a miracle, but even miracles need maintenance.
And adaptation.
And a lot of sand.
And a lot of sand.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the Delta works. From the 1 in 10,000 year risks to the massive robot arms of Rotterdam, there is a lot to chew on.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today with a word that you probably hear, I don't know, 10 or 20 times a day.
At least.
Yeah, at least. And you likely just don't give it a second thought. It's one of those invisible words that just blends completely into the background noise of everyday life.
Right.
Volume.
It's deceptive, really.
Right.
It feels incredibly mundane.
It really does. I mean, usually when I say volume, or, when you see it on a screen, you're just reaching for the remote to turn up the TV because you can't hear the dialogue over the music.
Exactly. Or maybe you're in the shower looking at the back of a shampoo bottle, trying to figure out if you have enough left for one more wash.
Yeah, but today we are not talking about sound waves. We aren't talking about decibels at all.
No, we are talking about space.
Space.
The fundamental fabric of our reality. The room you are sitting in right now, the coffee cup in your hand, the air in your lungs. All of it is defined by volume.
Exactly. We're talking about the amount of three-dimensional space that stuff occupies. And I have to admit, when I first looked at the stack of research you sent over for this, I was a little skeptical.
You thought it was going to be boring.
Well, I just thought, okay, length times width times height.
Right.
How hard can this be? We'll be done with this deep dive in 5 minutes. It's a box.
Yeah.
Done.
And then you fell down the rabbit hole.
I fell down a very deep, very geometric, and surprisingly political rabbit hole.
It really is.
Because it turns out the story of how we measure volume isn't just about math. It's about survival. It's about kings trying not to get overthrown by angry peasants.
Right, taxation.
Yeah, and ancient Egyptian payroll disputes. And eventually, it's about the speed of light and the fundamental constants of the universe.
That is the arc, really. It's a journey from survival estimation.
Just trying to make sure you have enough food to not starve this winter.
Exactly. Going from that to universal precision.
So that is our mission today. We're going to trace that exact arc. We're going to go from measuring grain with actual pig stomachs.
Which is fascinating.
Which, yes, is a real thing we need to discuss in detail. We're going from pig stomachs to calculating the volume of a digital dolphin using calculus.
And along the way, we really need to clarify what we are actually measuring. Because volume is a slippery term. It gets used in a lot of different contexts.
Yeah, so let's ground that definition right now. When a scientist or a mathematician says volume, what are they strictly referring to?
Strictly speaking, volume is the measure of the amount of three-dimensional space enclosed by a closed surface.
Okay, closed surface. That sounds a bit technical. Break that down for us.
Sure. Imagine any object, a box, a ball, a coffee cup, a planet. Volume is the amount of space that object occupies. It's the bigness of the object in 3D space.
Right.
Now, this usually gets quantified numerically. If you're using the metric system, the SI units, you were talking about cubic meters or liters.
And if you're in the U.S., like many of us, you are dealing with the absolute chaos of gallons and quarts, fluid ounces, cubic inches, bushels, pecks.
It's a lot. We will get to the chaos of units later.
Bet.
But before we do, there's an important distinction we need to make right off the bat. It's the difference between the volume of the container itself and the space it displaces.
Okay.
Or, more commonly, the distinction between volume and capacity.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that, because I use those words interchangeably all the time. I'll say, what's the volume of this gas tank? When I really mean, how much gas can I put inside it?
And in casual conversation, that's perfectly fine. We know what you mean. But in physics and engineering, and definitely in history, the distinction is crucial.
So what is the difference?
Volume is the space the object displaces. Capacity is the space the object contains.
Give me a visual.
Think of a hollow steel box.
Got it.
The capacity is the amount of air inside it, how much stuff you can pack into it. That might be huge. But the volume of the box itself,
The actual steel walls.
right, the amount of steel used to make it, that is relatively small. Now, imagine if you took a hydraulic press and crushed that box into a solid ball of metal.
Okay, so now it's just a dense lump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The capacity is dropped to zero. It can't hold anything anymore.
But the volume.
The volume of the steel, the actual amount of space the metal occupies in the universe, remains exactly the same.
Okay, that really helps. So, like, a sponge has a certain volume of sponge material, but a high capacity for water because of all the holes.
Precisely. And that distinction becomes very important when you start doing things like shipping oil or calculating buoyancy or trying to figure out if a ship will float.
Right.
But generally, the history of volume is the history of people trying to figure out capacity, asking, how much grain is in this jar?
Which brings us to the tone of today's deep dive. I have to say, looking through the research, I was totally surprised by how much drama there is in the history of volume.
Oh, absolutely.
You have kings passing laws, you have ancient Egyptian scribes sweating over payroll, you have Archimedes jumping out of bathtubs.
It wasn't just drama, though. It was a genuine struggle for consistency.
Right.
You have to remember, for most of human history, we didn't have a liter, we didn't have a gallon, we just had to survive.
And survival meant knowing how much grain you had for the winter.
Exactly. So the history of volume is really the history of civilization trying to organize itself.
So let's go back to that struggle. Section 1 of our deep dive, the ancient struggle for accuracy.
Let's do it.
We are starting way back, before the metric system, before standardized measuring cups. If I am a farmer in, say, 3000 BCE, and I need to trade you some wheat for a goat, how do we figure out how much wheat I'm actually giving you?
You use what you have, And what you have is your body and nature.
Okay.
The oldest methods of measuring volume were purely based on the human form, anthropomorphic
The
measurements.
handful method.
Literally.
Mm.
You might use a handful. You
Mm.
might use a double handful. You might use a pinch.
Which sounds charmingly rustic until you think about the actual economics of it.
It's a disaster for economics. Imagine we're at a market in ancient Mesopotamia. I'm selling saffron, which is incredibly expensive. And I say the price is 2 handfuls for a silver coin.
And I show up with hands the size of baseball mitts.
Exactly. I go broke.
Yeah.
Or if I'm the seller and I have tiny hands, you act like I'm ripping you off. The subjectivity of the human body is a terrible standard for trade.
It just leads to arguments.
It leads to mistrust. It is impossible to build a stable economy on handfuls.
So they needed something outside the body, something more consistent.
They looked to nature. Gourds were very common. A dried gourd is essentially a natural bottle.
But again, no two gourds are identical.
Exactly. So then they turned to biology.
And this is where the pig stomachs come in.
And sheep bladders.
I have to stop you there. Why? Just why?
It's actually very logical if you are a hunter-gatherer or an early pastoralist. You are butchering animals for food anyway. You have these organs left over.
I guess that makes sense.
A bladder or a stomach is a naturally sealed, waterproof container. Evolution basically designed them to hold volume.
Right, to hold fluids or food.
And within a specific species of animal, they're roughly the same size.
Roughly being the operative word there. I really can't imagine 2 sheep stomachs are exactly the same size down to the milliliter.
Oh, they definitely aren't. The source notes that precision in the ancient period usually ranged between 10 to 50 milliliters.
That's a pretty wide margin of error.
It's about 1 to 2 fluid ounces.
Wow.
So imagine buying a pint of beer and getting 2 ounces less than you paid for.
That would definitely cause a bar fight today.
Indeed it would. But in a hunter-gatherer society or early agriculture, that margin was acceptable.
It was the best they had.
Right. It's when you start building cities and empires that rough stops working. You need to pay workers. You need to tax farmers.
You can't tax someone based on a gourd of wheat if every single gourd is different.
Exactly. And this is where we see the shift to the big civilizations, ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Yeah, the source material mentions the Moscow mathematical papyrus from around 1820 BCE. That sounds incredibly specific.
It is. This is one of our oldest pieces of evidence for volume calculation. It shows that the Egyptians weren't just guessing. They were doing actual math.
They were solving problems to approximate the volume of simple shapes.
Right. They looked at cuboids, cylinders, even frustums.
Okay, a frustum, that sounds like a muscle you pull at the gym. Like, I pulled my frustum doing deadlifts.
It does sound like that. But a frustum is essentially a pyramid with the top chopped off.
Oh, okay.
Imagine a bucket shape. Wide at the top, narrow at the bottom.
Oh.
Or the base of a statue. That's a frustum.
Why were they so obsessed with frustum?
Granaries.
Ah.
Think about it. If you build a silo to store grain, you often taper at the bottom so the grain flows out easily, or you taper it at the top for structural stability.
Right.
Calculating the volume of a regular box is easy, length times width times height. But a frustum, the sides are sloping, the area changes at every single vertical point.
Yeah, that seems really hard to calculate without modern calculus.
It is hard. And yet, nearly 4,000 years ago, the Egyptians had a working formula for it.
That's amazing.
They needed to know exactly how much grain was in the silo just by measuring the outside dimensions. They couldn't just climb in and count the kernels.
And the Reisner Papyrus, this one seems more practical. The notes say it talks about concrete units.
Right. The Reisner Papyrus is fascinating because it shows the sheer bureaucracy of ancient Egypt. They had tables for length, width, depth, and volume for blocks of material.
They needed this for construction and for storing grain.
Exactly. They actually derived their volume units from their length units, which is a very modern idea.
So they took the cubit, which is a length, and made a volume cubit.
You've got it. We know the cubit was based on the forearm length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger.
Yeah.
So they had a volume cubit, which is 1 cubit by 1 cubit by 1 cubit.
Which is exactly how we define a cubic meter today, just with different lengths.
Exactly. They also had the volume palm and the volume digit.
A volume digit, so like a finger width cubed.
Essentially. The math was simple. A volume digit is 1 cubit times 1 cubit times 1 digit. They were trying to create a system where they could calculate the volume of a granary or a stone block just by measuring the sides.
This wasn't just fill this pig's stomach.
No, this was geometry.
Speaking of geometry and famous ancients, we have to talk about the big one. Archimedes, the man, the myth, the streaker.
The streaker.
Well, the story goes he ran down the street naked yelling, "Eureka!" right?
That is the popular legend, yes.
So the story we all learned in school is this. The king has a new golden crown. He suspects the goldsmith cheated him and mixed in some silver. He asks Archimedes to figure out if it's pure gold without scratching it.
Yeah.
Archimedes gets in a bath, sees the water rise, realizes that the volume of water displaced is equal to the volume of his body submerged.
Eureka moment.
Exactly. He yells Eureka, runs naked to the palace, dunks the crown, measures the water rise, compares it to a lump of pure gold, and catches the thief.
That is a wonderful story. It is dramatic, it's intuitive, and according to our sources, it is probably not how he actually did it.
You are crushing my childhood dreams here. Why not?
It really comes down to precision.
Mm-hmm.
The source explicitly mentions that the extreme precision required makes the water displacement method very difficult.
Okay, think about it.
A crown is a relatively small, intricate object. If you drop it into a bucket of water, the water level might rise, what, a millimeter? Half a millimeter?
Yeah, and if there is surface tension, the meniscus, where the water curves up the side of the bucket, it would be really hard to see the difference between the gold crown and the fake crown just by looking at the water level.
Exactly. The difference in volume between a pure gold crown and a slightly adulterated crown would be tiny. Trying to measure that vertical rise in a bowl of water would be prone to huge errors.
And Archimedes was a genius, so he would have known that.
He absolutely would have.
So what did he likely do instead?
The likely truth is he used a hydrostatic balance. This relies on Archimedes' principle, the idea of buoyancy, but it uses weight rather than volume measurement directly.
How does that work? Walk me through it.
Okay, you take the crown and you put it on one side of a scale. On the other side, you put a lump of pure gold that weighs exactly the same as the crown.
So in the air, sitting on his desk, the scale is perfectly balanced.
Okay, balanced in air. Now you lower the entire balance, both the crown and the gold lump, into a tank of water.
We're going underwater.
Yes. Now here's the physics. Archimedes' principle states that an object submerged in a fluid is buoyed up, pushed up, by a force equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces.
Okay, the water pushes back.
Right. Now if the crown is pure gold, it has the same density and the same volume as the gold lump. They will displace the exact same amount of water.
So they will experience the same upward force.
Exactly. The scale will stay perfectly balanced underwater.
But if the crown has silver in it...
Silver is less dense than gold. Think of it as fluffier in atomic terms. So a crown mixed with silver would be physically bulkier.
It would have a larger volume than the pure gold lump, even if they weigh the exact same in air.
Larger volume means it pushes away more water.
And because it displaces more water, the water pushes back harder.
Exactly. It feels a stronger upward force, more buoyancy. So the scale would tip. The crown side would rise up.
That is so much smarter. You don't need to measure the water level with a ruler. You just need to see if the scale tips.
Precisely. It turns a measurement problem into a simple visual check. It's elegant, precise, and much more likely to be the method a mind like Archimedes would use.
I love that. It takes the same principle, volume displacement, but applies it in a way that actually works in the real world.
Right.
It transforms volume from how much space into how much force.
And that leads us perfectly into section 2. Because Archimedes wasn't just dunking crowns, he was part of a long tradition of mathematicians trying to figure out how to calculate space.
So we are moving from the ancient struggle to the mathematics of space.
Yes.
This is where we get into the heavy hitters. Euclid, calculus, the stuff that makes high school students sweat.
It starts with Euclid's Elements, around 300 BCE. This was the Bible of geometry for 2,000 years.
Euclid established the exact formulas for things like parallel pipeheads, cones, and cylinders.
Right.
Parallelepipeds, I just like saying that word. It's basically a 3D parallelogram, right? Like a slanted box.
Correct. Euclid helped shift the perspective from measuring containers, how much grain is in this jar, to calculating shapes.
It's a conceptual leap.
It is.
Yeah.
You stop looking at the stuff inside and start looking at the abstract boundaries of the object. But the real game changer came much later, in the early 17th century, with a man named Bonaventura Cavalieri.
Cavalier, he sounds like a Renaissance artist.
He was an Italian mathematician and a Jesuit priest. And he came up with Cavalieri's principle. This is the intellectual bridge to calculus. He had this brilliant insight. He imagined that any 3D object is actually made up of an infinite number of incredibly thin 2D slices.
Like a loaf of bread.
Exactly like that.
Hmm.
Or a stack of paper. Imagine you have a stack of paper that forms a perfect cube. Now, push the side of the stack so it slants over.
It looks like the Leaning Tower of Pisa now.
But has the volume changed?
No, it's the exact same amount of paper.
Precisely. The shape has changed, but the volume is identical because the area of each slice is preserved. Cavalieri formalized this.
He said if you slice a shape infinitely thin, you can calculate the volume of even very irregular objects by understanding the area of those slices.
Yes.
Thinner and thinner slices. That philosophy led directly to modern integral calculus, right?
It did. Pierre de Fermat, Isaac Newton, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, they all expanded on this idea.
Right.
When you take a calculus class today and you learn to find the area under a curve or the volume of a shape, you're essentially summing up an infinite number of these infinitesimally small slices.
The outline mentions solids of revolution and the washer method. I remember staring at these terms in my textbook and feeling a headache coming on. Can you explain that in plain English?
Sure. Imagine you have a piece of wire bent into a curve.
Okay.
If you twirl that wire really fast around a stick, it looks like a 3D shape, right? Like a ghost of a vise or a bowl.
Yeah, looking at a spinning fan blade, it looks like a solid disc.
Exactly. That is a solid of revolution. Calculus allows us to calculate the exact volume of that shape. If the shape is solid, we use the disk method.
Okay.
But if the shape has a hole in the middle, like a donut or a thick pipe, we use the washer method.
Because a washer is just a flat disc with a hole in it.
Right. The formula basically calculates the volume of the outer shape and subtracts the volume of the inner hole.
Got it.
Mathematically, it looks like pi times the integral of the outer radius squared minus the inner radius squared.
Okay, let's not get too bogged down in the formula or I'll have flashbacks. But the point is, we went from this pig's stomach looks full to I can calculate the volume of a curve spun around an axis using infinite slices.
And we use that logic today for things that are incredibly complex. The source mentions a low poly triangle mesh of a dolphin.
A dolphin mesh. This is computer graphics, right?
Yes. In video games or 3D printing, a computer doesn't know what a dolphin is. It doesn't know smooth skin.
Right.
It defines the dolphin surface as thousands of tiny flat triangles connected together. This is called a polygon mesh.
So it looks like a low-res origami dolphin.
Exactly. To find the volume of that digital dolphin, say, to know how much plastic it will take to 3D print it, the computer uses algorithms based on that exact same principle.
It breaks the complex shape down into simple geometrical parts.
Pyramids connected to the center usually, and sums them all up.
So the ancient Egyptians measured blocks with cubits, and we measured digital dolphins with polygons. Same concept, just way more data.
Exactly. The resolution has just gone from stone blocks to microns. But having the math is only half the battle.
Right, because you also need everyone to agree on what a 1 is. What is 1 unit?
And that brings us to Section 3, standardization.
From kings to Krypton. This is the political history of volume.
And it is a messy history. If you look at the medieval period, the array of units was just confusing. The source lists the sester, the amber, the coum, and the seam.
I have never heard of a coum in my life.
The coum was a dry measure, mostly for grain. It was roughly 4 bushels.
Okay.
But the problem wasn't just the weird names. It was that a coum in one town might be completely different from a coum in the next town over. This variation caused chaos for trade.
Imagine trying to bake a cake where the recipe calls for a sester of flour, but your sester cup is half the size of the baker's.
Or, more importantly, imagine paying taxes. If the king demands 100 seams of wheat and his seam is bigger than yours, you are in real trouble.
This is why Henry III of England stepped in.
The Assize of Bread and Ale in 1258.
This was a landmark statute. The notes say it standardized weight, length, and volume.
It did. It introduced the gallon and the bushel as legally defined units. It was basically consumer protection in the 13th century.
Why bread and ale, specifically?
Because that's what people lived on. The statute linked the price of bread to the price of wheat. But to do that, you needed to know exactly how much wheat was in a bushel.
If the bushel size varied, the price control wouldn't work at all.
Yeah, exactly. So standardization was actually a crucial form of economic regulation.
So kings were the original standards bureaus.
They had to be. Stability depended on it. I also see a note here about the London Pharmacopoeia in 1618. That's a medicine catalog.
Right. While bakers needed rough accuracy, apothecaries, medicine makers needed real precision.
Exactly. You can't be roughly right when mixing poisons and cures. They adopted the Roman gallon or congus as a basic unit.
This is where we see the uncertainty narrowing.
Yes, the source says around this time, precision improved to between 1 and 5 milliliters.
That is much better than the handful days. But the real revolution, pun intended, came with the French.
The French Revolution.
It's
1795. The Enlightenment in action.
The French revolutionaries wanted to overthrow the king, but they also wanted to overthrow the irrationality of the old systems.
They wanted a system based on reason, not tradition.
Enter the metric system.
And they did it beautifully. They formally defined the metric system in French law using 6 units. 3 of them were strictly related to volume.
You had the stare, which was 1 cubic meter, specifically for measuring firewood.
Which is interesting that firewood was important enough to get its very own base unit.
Energy is always important. Then you had the liter, which was 1 cubic decimeter for liquids.
And here is the genius part. They connected volume to mass. They defined the gram as the mass of 1 cubic centimeter of water at the melting point of ice.
That is the part that always blows my mind about the metric system. It's all connected.
Right.
Length defines volume. Volume of water defines mass. 1 cubic centimeter of water weighs 1 gram. It's so clean compared to how many ounces in a pound.
It created a cohesive system. Before this, length, volume, and mass were often completely separate systems with no mathematical relationship.
The French Revolution linked them all into one chain of logic based on water.
But even that wasn't precise enough for the modern world.
Yeah, the source mentions that in the 20th century, we had to redefine everything again.
We moved from kings to krypton. See, the problem with defining a meter as this metal bar in Paris, the international prototype meter, is that metal bars change.
They expand when it's hot, they contract when it's cold.
They can corrode. If your standard changes, the whole universe of measurement wobbles.
So they look for something that never changes.
Atoms.
Oh.
In 1960, they redefined the meter based on the emission line of krypton-86 atoms.
And then in 1983, and updated again in 2019, they went even further.
Right. Now, the definition of the meter, and therefore the cubic meter, is tied to the speed of light, and the second, which is based on a cesium standard.
So a meter is effectively the distance light travels in a vacuum in 1,299,792,458 of a second.
Exactly. The meter is no longer a physical object, it is a concept of physics.
This means volume is now anchored to the fundamental constants of the universe.
If aliens landed, they wouldn't know what a King Henry is, but they would know the speed of light. We could communicate our volume to them perfectly.
That is a long way from a pig stomach.
It certainly is.
Okay, let's move to section 4, capacity, precision, and derived quantities. Because we talked about the definition, but how do we actually use this stuff in the real world?
Let's do it.
And I want to go back to that tank example from the outline because it really confused me at first.
The petroleum tank example. This illustrates the difference between physical volume, the capacity, and the weak capacity.
Right. The source says a 50,000-barrel tank might hold 7,200 tons of fuel oil.
Yes.
But that same tank cannot hold 7,200 tons of naphtha. Why?
It comes down to density. Naphtha is a liquid hydrocarbon mixture, often used as a solvent. The key here is density.
Naphtha is lighter, less dense than fuel oil?
Correct.
So it's fluffier. Can I call a liquid fluffy?
In a sense, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It takes up more space for the exact same amount of weight. Think of it like popcorn versus lead.
Okay.
If you have a box that holds 10 pounds of lead and you try to put 10 pounds of popcorn in it, the popcorn will overflow long before you hit 10 pounds.
Because the popcorn takes up way more volume for the same weight.
Exactly. Naphtha takes up more space per ton than fuel oil. So the tank hits its volume limit. It physically fills to the brim before it hits the weight limit of 7,200 tons.
The constraint is the physical space, the volume.
That's a crucial distinction for logistics. You can't just look at the weight rating of a ship or a tank. You have to know the volume of the stuff you're putting in it.
And you need the right tools to measure that volume. The source draws a great contrast between the kitchen and the lab.
Yeah, calibrated measuring cups are fine for your Sunday pancakes, but they aren't science.
If you look at a kitchen measuring cup, the lines are printed on, the glass might be slightly warped. Being off by 5 milliliters won't ruin your cake.
But in a lab, being off by a microliter can completely ruin an experiment.
So what do they use?
They use things like volumetric flasks, which are specifically calibrated to contain a precise volume at a specific temperature.
Or the air displacement pipette.
Right. This is used in biology. It uses a piston to displace a specific volume of air, which then pulls up the exact same volume of liquid. We are talking about measuring fluids at the microscopic scale.
And on the flip side of that, you have the industrial scale. Those giant petroleum tanks holding 1 million barrels, that's 160 million liters.
And believe it or not, they measure those with extreme precision too. But at that scale, you have to account for things you totally ignore in the kitchen,
Like temperature.
because liquids expand when they get hot.
Right. If you have 160 million liters of oil and the sun comes out and warms the tank by 10 degrees, that oil expands significantly.
The level goes up. You might think you have thousands of liters more than you actually do.
So industrial volume measurement is a complex calculus of density, temperature, and pressure.
You aren't just reading a dipstick. You are solving an equation.
It also mentions derived quantities in the notes. This is how volume helps us calculate other stuff.
Volume is a building block.
Yeah.
Once you have volume, you can calculate density, which is mass divided by volume.
You can calculate flow rate, how much volume passes through a pipe per second.
You can calculate specific volume, which is the inverse of density. Almost all engineering, how planes fly, how ships float, how engines run, relies on these derived quantities.
It really is the bedrock of how we describe the physical world.
It is.
So we've covered a lot. We've gone from ancient Egypt to modern physics. Let's wrap this up with our outro. What is the big takeaway here?
For me, the takeaway is that volume is the connector. It connects the abstract math, the geometry of Euclid, and the calculus of Newton to the messy physical reality of how much.
How much fuel, how much water, how much space?
We started with volume digits and pig bladders, desperate to just make trade work.
And now we use the speed of light to measure the volume of a digital dolphin mesh.
It's a testament to human ingenuity. We took a concept that nature didn't hand us a ruler for, and we built a ruler out of the universe itself.
That is a beautiful way to put it.
It's true.
But before we go, I want to leave you, the listener, with that final provocative thought from the source material. We live in a 3D world. We understand volume. But the math doesn't stop at 3 dimensions.
No, it doesn't.
The source mentions that 0, 1, and 2-dimensional objects have no volume. A line has length, but 0 volume. A square has area, but 0 volume.
But in 4 or higher dimensions, there is an analogous concept called hypervolume.
Hypervolume.
Just as volume measures the content of a 3D shape, hypervolume measures the content of a 4D shape. We can calculate it mathematically.
We can write the formulas for it.
We can tell you the hypervolume of a 4-dimensional sphere, but we cannot see it. Our brains are simply not wired to perceive it.
So if volume is our measure of reality in the space we actually live in, what exactly does hypervolume measure?
What is quantity in a dimension we can't even perceive?
That is the big question. And
Okay.
maybe, just maybe, our entire universe, our entire volume of space, the stars, the galaxies, your coffee cup, is just a thin slice.
A capillary slice.
The capillary slice of a much larger 4D hypervolume that we are just floating in.
It's entirely possible.
Now that is something to think about while you pour your morning coffee. Thanks for listening to this deep dive into volume. We will catch you on the next one.